Hello and a really warm welcome to video 4 of Life Unlimited, 10 Steps to Real Change. And what I'm going to do in this video is focus on the next 2 steps. So step 2, which is what is connection, what is love? And then step 3, which is about focusing on love of self. So step 2, what is connection and love? The reason for looking at that, of course, just to go back to what I've been talking about in previous videos, is that what we're trying to do here, one of the main things that we're trying to do to improve things and to live this life unlimited, is to put more of our thought, feeling and behavioural energy into connection. And in order to do that, though, we have to look at and understand what is connection for us. What does connection look, feel, sound like? What are the qualities of connection? Probably the most common connection word that we would use would be love. Fondness, affection, friendship, would be other ways of describing connection, attachment. But the most common word I think that people would use would be love. If I was asking people in an emotional needs inventory, which I talk about in a subsequent video under feelings, what one of their main emotional needs would be, and to list them, most people would say to love and be loved. But what we need to make sure of is this way in which we describe connection, love. What are the qualities that we associate with it? Is love the role that it plays in our life at the moment? How we experience it, how we give it out? Are we sure that is actually love? Because, of course, what can happen in early experience where there is that basic, we attach to, so we love our caregivers, as I've described in the past, what that relationship can become characterized by is some anger, jealousy, fear, some narcissism, some even neglectful behaviour, even abusive behaviour. And therefore our definition of love and what we understand it to be can get a very confused definition. And the difficulty there can be that we carry that on as our understanding of what attachment and love is and what it feels like and how we should behave towards others in a loving way. We then carry that on into our romantic relationships, friendships, relationships with our own children throughout life. So what I'm talking about here is making sure that our definition of love and what we understand it to be and how we express it is actually what we want in terms of love and what we need. Love should make us feel good. Of course, if we love somebody and we're attached to them, at times we'll get angry. At times we'll feel fearful. At times we'll feel switched off. We're all ebbing and flowing all the time, and so are the people that we're in relationship with. So it's not possible to consistently be in that place of attachment. Everybody's going between, connection and disconnection all the time. But what can happen is that relationships, attachments can become characterized by criticism, complaint, defensiveness, stonewalling, those sort of 4 horsemen in terms of relationships ending. And what we want, and the reason that people can get into those sort of habits and tolerate that, I think, is that during early experience, that was what that attachment meant. It was characterized by much more of those things than actually feeling good and safe and rewarded and connected with other people. So that's what I'm going to talk about during this video, is looking at what are the qualities of love, just making that clear, and then, as I say, with the next step is turning those qualities towards ourselves and making sure that we're relating to ourselves with those qualities on the basis that if we do that and we turn love inwards and we relate to ourselves with love, that's absolutely what we're going to do in terms of relating to other people as well. So a headline here would be, if it hurts, it isn't love, as I put on the slide there. I believe that love and dislike, for example, are mutually exclusive. Some people might say that they love somebody, but they dislike them. And I think in that situation, if that is the case, somebody has got a bit of a confused definition of what love is. I completely understand that I might love somebody or like somebody 1 minute, and then they say or do something which triggers me, and then I dislike them. But if the relationship is characterized by a pattern of dislike, then I don't believe that I love them. The dislike place is a place of disconnection. Love, is a place of connection. Then, as I say, they're mutually exclusive. Okay, so just moving on to talk some more about love. The key here is that love of self is the primary place to start with all this. Of course, we're going to need love from other people. Of course, it's going to feel good for other people to tell us that they love us and show us that they love us, and for us to say that to other people. So that love that can come through relationship with others, it's always going to feel good. It's an absolutely necessary and vital part of our lives and this place of connection and staying in connection. I'm going to talk in a subsequent video much later on about relationships with others and how to make sure that we're consistently in a place of connection much more often. The thing is, what can happen for a lot of us if our internal experience is dominated by that threat part, which is about flaws and problems and criticisms, there is no or very little internally generated love for us. What we do if we look in is, as I say, look at a problem, and if we're looking out, we're angry and fearful potentially, or switched off. None of those places are a source of nurturing and support internally for us. The same with rewards and this dominant reward place of addiction. What we're looking at there is how things can change externally, how we can make things different. It's not about like the contentment and wholeness that comes with that place of love of self. So we're always going to need other people, as I say, to show love to us. But what we don't want is to be entirely dependent on that, because other people have their difficulties and distress, and they have their threat part, and they have their potential for dominant reward as well. So as much as we will need and want that from other people, and as much as that's going to be a big part of our lives, what this video is really about is making sure that that internally generated love, the support and nurturing that we give ourselves, is getting much more energy at this sort of early stage of this course. What does threat think of love? Just to say, it often looks at it as sentimental, mushy, soft. So you can see there that it finds the problem in it, which is not surprising, because that's the role that it takes with anything. That's the lens through which it looks at anything. I also think that perhaps because during early experience love came with pain, threat can turn it against it a bit. We don't need to love people to actually survive, which is all threat cares about. So the impression that you may have got of love is that it is something sentimental or soft or not important. But the point that I want to make is that connection and love is going to be this source of huge strength for you. So that's the reason why we're putting much more energy into it. So in terms of a first exercise, what's really helpful here is to have a think about what love meant for you growing up. If you would say that your caregivers loved you and that there was love present in the home, what did you see? What were the qualities that you saw in those loving caregivers? What was demonstrated towards you? If you think of all the people that are in your life at that time and think, well, I feel like that person loved me, perhaps those people were not as loving, but this one was. What qualities did that person demonstrate that showed you that they loved you? What was it that made you feel so safe with them? And if you love someone now and would say that, think of the person that you love most, and then think about the qualities that you would demonstrate towards them. So none of this is saying that those things aren't present in your life. What we're doing with all of this, and in a lot of these videos, is just making things conscious. So some of those things will work well for you. Some of the things you associate with love and loving qualities will work very well for you. But we just want to look at those things that may not, that may be following on from childhood, that weren't about love, that were about control, or somebody being a narcissistic extension of a caregiver, whatever that might be. So what did love mean to you when you were growing up? What does it mean to you now, as I say? So if you're looking at your relationships now and being loved by others and loving others, what qualities are being demonstrated? What are the behaviours that are consistent with that? And if there is a situation where, when you think about that and make that conscious, that there are ways in which it may not be working for you, or that a trauma bond that happened there has meant that jealousy, controlling behaviour, too much anger have really got enmeshed with that attached and loving place, what would you like to do instead from this point on? What would you prefer to do? At least holding those things conscious in your mind. Changing patterns, as I've said in the past, is very difficult, particularly ones around attachment. But to have a cognitive awareness of what you might like it to be like, as far as the qualities, is is the first thing to do here, I would say. This, you should know that I love you because I'm here. It is often the place of early experience there, a parent and child dynamic. Actually, love is a verb, love is a doing word. So think in terms of the qualities that are being demonstrated, the behaviour that you can see as far as knowing somebody loves you. I mean, of course, two people can be in a room with each other and what's going on in their minds is very much about criticism and complaint of the other person, or even actively, explicitly in language. And that is not the place of love, is the point that I'm making. The next step is looking at love of self and making sure that we are primarily dealing with ourselves and relating to ourselves and handling ourselves in a loving way. So what I've just asked you to do is have a think about what those qualities might be. And what I'm going to do is just suggest some qualities that I believe are loving qualities and how we might use them and in relation to self, because for a lot of us, when we're talking about love and attachment, we do think in terms of other people and, as I say, relationships between ourselves and others. But the most important place, I know I keep making the point, but the most important place is how we relate to ourselves in this way, because everything else just follows from that. If that's working in the way that we want it to, if that loving connected state is happening internally more often than not, if we're in that calm and alive place, that flows out to everyone else around us without us even having to try particularly. So, step 3, loving yourself, and what those qualities are, how you're going to handle yourself and relate to yourself. The first one that I would talk about is compassion. I would describe compassion as loving kindness. What happens for a lot of us when dominant threats are around, because it's about flaws and criticisms and problems and identifying deficits, is that the worst things that we hear about ourselves are not necessarily what other people might say about us, but the ways in which we describe ourselves in that internal dialogue. So I might have people say that they're losers or failures or chaos, or they can't cope. And if I say, has anyone else ever said that to you? They will say, no, they haven't. Because, as I say, what can often happen with this dominant threat place is it distorts our perception of us. Because it's entirely problem focused, you can see how the sort of image that it builds up of us is that it could be a failure or a loser, because it never grounds the good and the great and even the neutral about us. So what we want to introduce here is making sure that whenever we relate to self, whenever there's an internal dialogue going on and we're talking about self and we're going through things in terms of feelings, that we relate to ourselves compassionately. People will often say, again, I need a kick up the backside if there's something that's problematic. If they said, well, I'm not going to get angry again. I don't like anger being such a part of my life. So what I'm going to make sure that I don't do that. And then they do, because it's difficult to change patterns. What they might do is get angry with themselves, this kind of I need a kick up the backside type experience of self. The difficulty with getting angry or frustrated with yourself for getting angry is, of course, it's all part of the same territory. It's all part of that threat. And threat switches off your cognitive function. Threat switches off your memory, and it's more fuel for that fire. So rather than thinking in terms of fighting something internally, people might say that they will fight depression, they'll fight their addiction. Depression and addiction are an internal experience, and we can't disown. Well, we can try to, and I think that's what threat does, unfortunately, is it encourages us to try and disown or exile a part of self by fighting it. And the thing is, if you fight something internally, if you're in conflict with it, if you want to disown it and you hate it and you're disconnected from it, you have no relationship with it. And therefore, it can act out outside of your control. So the thing about compassion is, please, if you have a part of yourself which you don't like, maybe that's the depressed part, the chronically angry part, the part that keeps acting out in terms of addictive behaviour, please look at it with kindness and empathy, because that is not a matter of saying, oh, just go for your life and do whatever. It's not a matter of allowing that part to behave in whatever way it wants. What it's about is trying to understand it and relate to it. And if we try to understand and relate to a part of ourselves which is in distress, That is the way to change it. I believe that's the only way it's going to be different, is if we try and understand what it's doing. If you're looking at depression, if you're looking at social anxiety, if you're looking at chronic anger, try and understand why it's behaving the way it is, because it will be trying to do that in your best interests. It's become distorted and actually is doing the opposite often. But if you're looking at addictive behaviour, the original intention of it was to help you to cope in a particular environment. Probably it was what was modelled, whatever that might be. And I understand that it's got to a stage where it's doing the opposite, but we need to empathise with it so that we can have a relationship, so that we can sort of talk it through with it and have that internal relationship, which means we can make changes. Rather than those parts living separate lives outside of our control. So, as it says in the slide, your parts, threat, reward, connection, are all stronger working together. And in order to work together, they need to talk to each other and not talk to each other in an angry, frustrated way. I know those things will come up, threats there, I understand that. But if we can move as quickly as we can to a place of compassion for those different parts, then I think that's going to be really helpful. Try to relate to those parts as if you would somebody that you love. So if you're looking at partly the dominant threat, which leads to social anxiety, for example, if there was somebody that you loved who was experiencing social anxiety, I don't think you would get angry with them, because you know that if you got angry with them, they might stop talking about it, they might stop telling you, but it wouldn't help with their social anxiety. It wouldn't make things help them to feel any more safe socially. In fact, it would mean that they would feel less safe socially. They just probably wouldn't tell you. So you give them another thing to carry there. And that's the same with your internal parts. If you get angry with anger or fear or addictions, you just give them something more to carry. A very significant trigger generally recognised for addictive behaviour will be anger. And that's not just other people's anger. What's happening for most people there is anger at themselves. It's the feeling that is triggering. So we need to make sure that we're not triggering that in ourselves. We've got to make sure that we talk to ourselves in a kind and loving way. Boundaried, of course, but we can absolutely say, I don't want that behaviour to continue. It's unhelpful to ourselves, without chastising ourselves or castigating ourselves or raging at ourselves. So just in terms of that internal dialogue, in future videos, I'm going to look at thoughts and how we talk to ourselves. But just to say here, in terms of how you address yourself internally, I would suggest that you address yourself as you would somebody that you love. So if you would call somebody darling, sweetheart, dear one, fella, whatever that might be, just an affectionate term, it can be a nice idea to try and encourage that sort of warmer, more compassionate internal experience to address yourself in that way. I know it might feel a bit contrived, but it can make a very significant change internally. It can really calm things down if we know that we're talking to each part, and that includes the addicted part, for example, that we struggle with so much, or the depressed part that we might struggle with so much, to really address those parts in a way that we would somebody that we had an affection for, because it's only through relationship, as I say, that changes are going to be made. So, as it says in the slide, no one should love you or support you more than you do internally. And as I said, in relation to thoughts, I'm going to talk about that dialogue and just making that really conscious as to what's happening in your mind and your body all the time. Tens of thousands of thoughts a day, such potential for amazing stuff in life, but also such potential for difficulty and distress. So let's make sure that we're supporting ourselves as much as we can internally. And as I say, therefore, treating ourselves with compassion. And what will happen is that threat and reward part over time, particularly threat, will see that you will feel better. By relating to yourself more with compassion and kindness. You can more make the changes you might want to by relating to yourself in this way, and they will hand over control over time. I really do think that is what happens for people. It might take time, but they can see that as you feel calmer and make decisions which are more helpful for you, that threat place, which is really desperate to help you survive, but realizes that by being in connection more, it doesn't have to be as protective as it is, and it will hand over that control over time. But we can't wrestle control off it. We can't get so angry with it that it gives over control. That won't happen. We have to do it in a way that it understands and feels empathized with, that part of us. So moving on then to empathy, we talk about empathy a lot in relation to empathizing with other people, and we know that if we love somebody, that's what we'll do. Empathy means that we'll use our imagination to try and imagine what it's like in somebody else's shoes, and we know the power of that in terms of the attachment and how good that feels for other people, and what an important part of love that is, to be able to empathize for another person. So if we're looking here at love of self and making sure that we do love ourselves and are treating ourselves in that way, we need to make sure that we empathize with ourselves, and that includes looking back at early experience and all the difficult things we went through. If I use bullying as an example, what would have happened at that time is that we may have, in order to get on and carry on, developed a belief that was somehow we did something to deserve that. It can often be what a child will do. I've already talked about it in the context of early experience. They will take the blame in order to continue, because they have to continue in that environment. Where else do you go? So taking it on as a problem in themselves is something that children will often do, which means that we won't have empathised with ourselves there. What we might have developed is a belief that there's something wrong with us, that there's some defectiveness about us. So now perhaps look back at early experience, and you can do this with yourself. If that's difficult, then perhaps do it in the context of therapy or talking to others that you trust. But try to rethink what happened to you, the difficult things that happened to you, with empathy. And again, in order to try and connect with that, try and think about the person that you love most in the world going through the things that you did in early experience, and see if that makes a difference, and see what comes up for you there, and see what you would say to them and how you would experience them. Again, it's using your imagination to get yourself into that connection part of self all the time. And also in relation to current experience, when you go through a difficult thing today, perhaps if you get reactively angry, or you're feeling hopeless, or you're feeling helpless, really try to empathize with yourself rather than turning on yourself. Relate to yourself with compassion, try to understand what's happening for you. And I think that will result in a change. Often that results in our ability to move through a particular felt experience. Again, I'm going to talk about this in the context of feelings, but we need to feel things to a degree in order to move through them. Often what will happen if we turn on ourselves with anger is we will get stuck in something. So then moving on to gratitude, really important here as far as relating to self with gratitude. By that I mean, say, thinking of 3 things a day that you're grateful for. What people will often think of is perhaps material possessions or people around them, and those are really important things to be included. Whatever it is, what gratitude is doing, a gratitude practice does, and why it's so important, is it sort of closes the gaps that threat and a reward open up. So if you have this dominant threat part, all that's doing is identifying problems and ways in which things can change. It's trying to solve problems, I understand, but in order to solve it, identifies and uses imagination to identify. So it sort of creates gaps all the time and deficits, as I've already said. And the reward place is there whenever it's present, is sort of saying that this is not enough. In this current situation, I need it to change. So again, there's a deficit, there's a gap. What gratitude does is it closes those gaps, because it grounds in your mind those things that you wouldn't change, those things that you are either very happy with in life or they're just neutral. So it's really grounding the worth and value. Often when people talk about it initially, the things around them. What I think we need to add to this gratitude practice is making sure that you include in that things about yourself that you're grateful for. Dominant threat will always have distorted and underestimated you and undervalued you internally. To include in a gratitude practice things about yourself, skills, competencies, talent, whatever they may be, to include those things about yourself that have been so helpful for you, that have absolutely always been present for all of your life, but that you probably haven't noticed as much, because our natural state is to identify problems. Those things are there. We just need to make sure that your attention is drawn to them, and a gratitude practice does that. So, as I say, qualities about you, how you communicate, humour, intelligence, whatever they may be, and also very importantly to include, so as to improve communication and connection with your body, is things you're grateful for about your body. And I know these things are difficult, for somebody where depression has been around or high anxiety, that is just not the way the brain thinks, because it's, as I say, dominated by problems. But just because that's not what we're used to thinking doesn't mean those things aren't there. And I think if you move your attention more to particularly those things about yourself, your body, you as a person, that you're grateful for, you will notice those things more as well. Whatever you give your attention to grows. And importantly, because we get a reward internally from doing that, and it helps us to feel a bit happier, a bit safer internally, as well as dealing with that dominant threat part, it makes us less likely to go to try and change our state and help ourselves to feel better with a particular behaviour or substance. Feeding ourselves internally, nurturing ourselves internally through whatever way, compassion, a gratitude practice, whatever it is, makes it much less likely for us to act out to change our state. So hold in mind, the quickest way as far as gratitude, the quickest way to happiness is to want the things that you already have. So please treat gratitude as a necessity from this point on, rather than a luxury if we're looking at connection with self and others. And as I say, please try to introduce a gratitude practice, and just do it as often as you can. Suggest something daily, but as often as you can do it, that's great. And I think the more often you do it, the better you'll feel, and therefore the more you will do it. Next, as far as a loving quality, I would identify as integrity. And I would say integrity is doing the right thing, even when no one's looking. As far as integrity, what can happen with dominant threat is we have quite a different public and personal persona. Because we might be fearful or people-pleasing, we're very nice out here in front of other people, but there can be quite a different story of criticism or complaint behind the scenes. And what is helpful, I think, in terms of love of self and connection with self, is to make sure that public and private persona are quite close to each other, and that behind the scenes, as far as I say, taking care of myself, that I make sure that how I'm thinking when other people aren't looking is more at that place of connection, is more that place of love. Another way, a loving quality to demonstrate to myself, is forgiveness. Forgiveness means looking at a situation or looking back without anger. And the most important thing to remember here is that whatever you've gone through, you were doing your best at the time. Regret will be that place of threat. I understand that we need to feel guilt sometimes about things, because guilt is a feeling that we get when we've done something that crosses our moral compass. It can be quite an important thing to feel, to sort of check our behaviour. But if dominant threat is around, we're not talking about a situation like that. What will be happening with dominant threat is we'll get angry with ourselves for doing our best. We use hindsight, the benefit of hindsight, to say, well, we should have known that, and therefore that was bad of us to do that at the time. We had no crystal ball. There's no such thing. So please, it will come forward, threat will come forward and do that. But as I say, can we move empathy in? Can we move compassion in, and say to ourselves, we did our best at the time, and forgive ourselves, and at least accept it as part of our past, so it doesn't keep troubling us here. So no records of wrongs. As I say, threat will try to do that, and if we're looking at it compassionately and trying to relate to it, we can say to it, I can understand why you're doing that. I know you're just trying to take care of me to make sure I don't do it again, but I know I'm not going to do that thing again, right? I know that I'm trying to move that out of life, but the way to move that out of life is not to look back over my past with regret, is not to feel shame, because that's just more threat territory, and therefore it's more likely to happen again. So forgiveness of self, really important. Acceptance of self can be quite similar, but if I've already talked about in the context of change, that what we're doing here is not making these changes on the basis there's something wrong with me or defective about me. The way that I do things and the way it is just what I was conditioned into doing. And some of those things will work very well. If you're looking at that gratitude practice, what I really hope is at this early stage, you start to identify things about yourself and the way you do things which are amazing, and things that may just be neutral. So things that you wouldn't change. As I say, there are absolutely skills, qualities, competencies that are there and have been, and things you've developed throughout life which will work incredibly well for you, and you have to have a grounded experience of what those things are. But often, the dominant threat place will be one of shame internally, and that there's a defectiveness about me. So yes, we're making these changes. Yes, there are aspects that probably could work differently, and we're going to make these changes from the point of view of them being more helpful for us to do that from this point on. But let's accept who we are as we are now, and as I say, to the extent that we can at this early stage, value an amount of that too. Then patience with self. I talk about patience in the context of other people. Patience would be waiting without anger. It's not that you wait, it's how you wait, and it's waiting without anger and annoyance. So please relate to yourself through this process. I did mention it in the context of change, but it's a very loving quality to be patient, and it is loving because it's waiting or relating to self without anger. So it is absolutely that place of connection. And finally, just as far as an imagination exercise, I'm going to have talked about it a bit. I'm going to talk in a subsequent video about creative imagination and the huge importance of that in keeping ourselves in this place of connection with self and others, because what dominant threat often does is fear in imagination catastrophizes. It takes apart, it causes problems. Anger in imagination, again, disconnecting, criticism of others, criticism of self, and the reward place uses imagination just to get us to act out again. So creative imagination, as I'll come on to in a video, is a real way to counter this and crowd out that dominant threat or dominant reward place. So at this early stage, can you use your imagination just to try to imagine a personification of this loving place within you? Personification, because it can be easier to bring that part into mind when it has a shape, and that can be, a physical shape, somebody that you know, somebody you've seen on television, film. It doesn't matter if they are actually that loving, it's just what you associate with them, shapes, colours, animals, whatever that might be, something that you can bring into mind, that when your fear part steps forward, or when your anger part steps forward, or your addicted part steps forward, that can relate to those parts, because they're going to do it in a loving way, which is going to be much more helpful. And as I said, a loving way holds boundaries and makes it clear that something might need to be different here, but it does it in a way that is nurturing and supportive and empathetic and understanding. So try to imagine who that figure is, and hopefully when those parts step forward, just try bringing that part also into mind and imagination, and see what the relationship is like between the two of them in terms of your internal dialogue. Okay, so, this isn't a definitive list in terms of love of self and loving qualities. There may be others that I don't doubt. There are others that you would associate. Humour, for example, another very loving quality potentially. Equanimity, various other qualities. I list some more in my book. I've just drawn out some of the ones that I think are key at this stage to look at. So, there may be ones you disagree with. Add to that list. Just all I'm talking about is being curious, making it conscious at this stage, and just having a clearer idea of that in your own mind. Next video, I'm going to talk about who we're in love with, so who we're connecting to, and go through getting to know ourselves more in terms of thoughts, feelings, body, behaviour, etc. So I hope this has been helpful, and I shall see you there.